You're listening to episode 308 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Blair Hurley joins us to speak about her new Buddhist fiction book, The Devoted. Hi everyone. I want to thank you for supporting the Secular Buddhist Association with your generous contributions. Because of that dana, we're able to continue offering this podcast, the discussions on our website, secularbuddhism.org, and of course, our live online practice circle. And if you haven't yet, you're welcome to visit the website and show your appreciation, as we appreciate you listening in and sharing your own voice in this exploration of the Dhamma in our lives. I know that many of you listening are avid readers and have sometimes asked about Buddhist fiction. We've not had a lot of those interviews on the podcast because it's not a particularly large portion of fiction writing. But today we do have a conversation about a new book you may be interested in. Blair Hurley received her AB from Princeton University and her MFA from NYU. Her stories are published or forthcoming in Ninth Letter, West Branch, Mid-American Review, Washington Square, Hayden's Ferry Review, and elsewhere. She received a 2018 Pushcart Prize and scholarships from Breadloaf and the Kimmel Harding Nelson Center for the Arts. So sit back, relax, and have a nice literary lemongrass tea. Our guest today is Blair Hurley. Blair, welcome to the podcast. Good to see you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we're here to talk about your new fiction novel, The Devoted. But before we get into that, why don't you tell us a bit about your background?
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up in a suburb of Boston, and I grew up actually, my roots, my ancestry is very Boston Irish Catholic. So I knew all about Catholic culture, I would say, growing up, though my own family was pretty secular, I would say, in our upbringing, in my upbringing. Though I did feel like that kind of religious culture can still be passed down from generation to generation, even though my parents were not practicing or devout in any way. So in a funny way, I had this early interest in spirituality and religion and belief, I think from a young age. And so I was sort of curious about my friends and other families who had religion and religious practice as part of their daily lives. It led to some kind of curiosity and exploration from a young age. So a lot of my friends were Jewish. So I remember at a young age, I was asking my parents, do I get a bat mitzvah? Can I have that? Or I also joined Yiddish club in high school, and I was the only non-Jewish member there. Every time that I entered a church or a religious space, I felt just kind of curious about why people were there and how it seemed to give them a sense of peace and community. So I was definitely, I think, curious from a young age about religious belief. Then I had a family friend, kind of like a beloved aunt figure in my life, who was raised Catholic and in her adult life converted to Zen Buddhism. And she would talk to me about her experience and how meaningful it was for her, how it was almost an ecstatic experience for her when, as she said, her head cracked open and the universe poured in. I was so interested in her experience, and we would have these long talks about life and existence and the universe. I was just curious about these questions, I think. So I knew I wanted to be a writer from a young age, and I was writing fictional stories. And I started realizing that the stories that I felt most passionate about were stories about religion and spirituality. So I started writing stories about fictional characters who were devout in one way or another. So I wrote a lot of stories about nuns and priests. I wrote stories about Buddhist practitioners. And I realized I was just really wanted to know more about this and explore it. So I did start reading a lot about Zen in particular, studying it and taking classes in college. I always approached it, I think, from a sort of scholarly perspective rather than a practitioner's perspective. I still felt a kind of wariness about officially joining a group or being initiated into an institution. And I think that has to do with some of the feelings that my family had about Catholicism, which was a very wary relationship with it, especially because as I was growing up in Boston, some of the sexual abuse scandals in the Catholic Church were breaking open. And the overall impression in my family was to be wary of religious institutions because of how corrupt they could be. So I had that kind of wariness, but I was still interested and curious about what religion could give people. So I did study Zen a lot in a scholarly and academic way. And then I felt finally confident to try writing about it for my first novel. So the novel came out of definitely my knowledge of Catholic culture, of Boston, and also my studies into Zen. And one thing that I learned the more I researched was that Zen's arrival in America was fraught itself, so that there were moments of incredible insight and revolution for young people, discovering Zen in the 50s and 60s in America. But it also came with some heartbreak too, with teachers who started abusing their power. And the more that I studied it, the more I saw parallels anyway between abuses of power that had happened in the Catholic Church as well. So I realized that there were parallels that I could write about. So that's what the novel is about in a lot of ways. It's about power and the abuse of authority, but it's also about the kind of powerful healing force that spirituality can give to people. So I didn't want the novel to be a diatribe either for or against religious devotion. I wanted to show what it gives people and also how power can be abused in many different traditions.
Right. It sounds like you were finding a balance of what your own experience had been in institutionalized spirituality can have some difficulties with it. And yet there is a call for something that moves people, that brings connection, that brings some meaning to life. And
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
sounds like this found its way in. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about just the storyline those themes are attached to.
Yes. So the novel is about one woman, a young woman who is growing up, raised strictly Catholic in Boston in the 90s and 2000s. And in the backdrop of the Catholic Church abuse scandals that are happening when she's a teenager, she decides to break away from Catholicism and she converts to Zen Buddhism. It causes a lot of chaos in her life because of her family's reaction and the fallout from this. So she runs away from home. Eventually, she finds a Zen master, but in time, he begins to abuse his power. And as the novel's opening, she's basically trapped in a manipulative sexual relationship with this teacher. So a lot of the novel is about her struggle to find her own sense of spiritual meaning and to free herself from this manipulative situation.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I'm very curious about the complexities for you as an author.
Mm-hmm.
When creating a main character, actively being harmed by someone in a position of power, that dynamic. And yet this is still a sexual and a spiritual person.
Yes.
They don't want to sever this part of their life. They still want to have this part of their life.
Right, right. That's what I found interesting about the kind of tricky territory that Buddhist teachers in America, I think, are navigating these days, because it's not nearly as well, it's not as celibate an environment as, say, a priest in a Catholic church. In fact, Zen teachers are allowed to be sexual, to have relationships, to be married. And so I was interested in thinking about how do American Buddhists in particular try to navigate this territory. I think a lot of American converts to Zen and to other branches of Buddhism are not interested in becoming monks or nuns. They're interested in finding a way for Buddhism to add meaning to their ordinary lives as sexual beings. And that is, my main character is named Nicole, and that is, I think, what she's trying to navigate. She's still very much, I think of her as a person with a lot of hunger and desire for life. And she wants to have sexual relationships. She wants to find a way to have spiritual meaning in her life too. I think a lot of the time, discussion about religion and spirituality sort of divorces itself from the sexual aspect of being human. We assume that these things are in conflict and they can never live together and coexist. But I think actually, for most people, sexuality is a part of life and can be a part of spiritual experience too. For Nicole, I think in some ways she's kind of confused the two things in a risky way, where whenever her teacher gives her some kind of insight or she accesses some kind of higher truth, she almost thinks that has to be with love and sex too. She's blending love relationships with teacher relationships, I think, which is very dangerous territory, I think.
Yeah, and we see that in fiction novels like your own, but as well in the real world. And
yes.
Something that's unfortunately quite common, that, of course, this is part of the background we see in recent and ongoing allegations of priest abuse of, say, children in the Catholic environment. We also see abuses of teachers of their students in Buddhism, in various branches of Buddhism, not just one.
Yes, as I was researching, and writing the novel, I realized that I saw more and more stories of this abuse that had been occurring, and I tried to really seek out testimonials from women who had experienced this. In this case, it's predominantly women who experienced this abuse, and what was all the more troubling about it, I think, for American Buddhist women, was how it was so unnamed. There wasn't really a word for the kind of abuse that was occurring. So in the case of children being abused, I think immediately we can recognize that as a deep wrong. In the case of adult women who may be consenting at the time or feeling like they can't say no, it starts to be a very gray area, I would say. And it made many women feel, I think, like they weren't sure whether they'd been violated or not. And that is, I think, fairly pernicious about it. So, yeah, I did my best. I really wanted to try to respect what their experience might have been. So I think one of the hardest things I was doing for the novel was to try to imagine myself into that private room where these abuses were occurring, and to try to capture it as respectfully as I could.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there were other challenges in addition to putting yourself in that imaginary context of what would this have been like. What were some of the other challenges in writing a book with these very complex and convoluted issues?
Yes, there were a few challenges. I would say one, as you mentioned, it's complicated. It was sort of complicated dynamics going on, gender politics, power and authority. A lot of the time I would write several different versions of a scene in which I was highlighting one aspect over the other. Maybe I would write one version of the scene where I would highlight the gender difference between the male teacher and the female student. Another time I would write it and it was more about the sexuality. Another time I would write it and it was more about my character's individual personality. I was struggling to figure out what to focus on. And so a lot of the time I had to tell myself, just keep it simple, simplify. What is your character thinking in that moment? I think another challenge that I was encountering was just trying to get into the mindset of my character and understand why she would continue to stay with this teacher, even though she's clearly being taken advantage of. I think that was a question my early readers of drafts would keep asking. And I think it's sort of like the question that many people who have experienced abuse are asked: why did she stay? And I realized
Often used as a way to disparage or weaken their case, as it often becomes a case against someone, is, oh, but you stayed in it. I'm like, well,
yes,
it's
yes.
not just so cut and dried.
Exactly. So it is a way in which the person being abused is being belittled in some way or made to seem foolish,
Right.
or maybe that the abuse wasn't that bad if they stayed. So yeah, I realized that I didn't fully know the answer and I had to do more work to think about what had gone into her life before this that would lead her to stay, why she would continue to hope for her own spiritual advancement, the things that she wanted in life and the things that she was getting out of that relationship with her teacher. So yeah, I would say that's always a big question mark. And I had to do more work to learn about my own character to answer the question.
Yeah, and it is an interesting situation in that the answer itself may not be one that results as it may for your character in the book in progress in what she does and how she lives her life. For some, and I'm always very curious about this dynamic, which I see in other contexts as well, not just abuse, in power differential kinds of situations where those who have been in these situations themselves, they've been what I might view as in an abusive relationship where
Mm-hmm.
there is maximizing that abuse of power for favors of some kind or other, that still stay and are strong proponents of it. And there seems to be a strong identity with the spiritual side of it,
Mm-hmm.
that this is part of the practice. This is what we do. And that's often used as the excuse of the abuser too, that, well, this is part of the training regimen that we do.
Right, right. I think that's really interesting. And again, I think I saw that coming out in the way that Zen was encountering American culture. I think there's a conflict there, or a way that people have to find a new way to navigate it, because Zen is coming out of a very traditional, hierarchical culture and tradition in which students must absolutely respect and obey their teachers, swear vows of loyalty and obedience to them, and trust their teacher absolutely. I think Americans tend to be more, just to make a cultural generalization, they tend to be a little more democratic and they are uneasy around power structures in which there's an absolute ruler and a subject. So I think the way that Zen is negotiating American culture is also really interesting. I think I'm seeing some changes and developments as it becomes more Americanized, possibly.
Yeah. And speaking of changes and developments, this is one of the things I'm really curious about, is that the Devote in your book is coming out at a time when the Me Too movement has helped empower those who have been harmed by sexual misconduct to speak about it. And
Mm-hmm.
your fictional account does mirror some actual events throughout Buddhism, including Zen, but not just Zen, that have been brought to light for many years now. And I think particularly in the West, because we do have a limited tolerance for that. I'm wondering if you have any aspirations about the influence your book may have around patriarchal Buddhist constructs or anything else.
Yes, it's funny how I started writing this book several years before the Me Too movement really began, but I think it's becoming increasingly relevant. And I'm very grateful to the Me Too movement for exposing these these really difficult power dynamics that are happening in the workplace. I think it began in the workplace, and now it is opening up into spiritual and other spheres too. So it definitely, there's been more exposure of these abuses in just in the past year or so than I'd seen before. And I think it's a really good thing, where people are reevaluating things that may have been tolerated for decades before this, actually. So it's kind of an exciting time. It's going to be a painful time for many people as well, but overall, I think it's to the good. I'm hopeful that my book, will speak to people who've experienced this in some way, people who weren't sure how they felt, maybe even people who have longed for a spiritual connection to something larger than themselves. I think that's really what I wrote the book for people who have always felt that kind of hunger for a deeper meaning to life, to someone who felt beauty in a religious experience and yet maybe had a heartbreaking experience. I think many religious women have to deal with this. If you want to be religious and you are a woman, it sometimes means accepting very disappointing rules and patriarchal systems. And so in The Devoted, Nicole is on a sort of spiritual quest. And that was one thing I wanted to write as well, because as I was growing up and reading books about spiritual quests, there were so many male spiritual quest stories, but very few female ones. So that was consciously in my mind. Like, I grew up loving books like The Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac. It's a great book and I still love it, but looking back at it, there are these moments where girls and women try to participate and they're always shut out. They're excluded from that. So I wanted to write a story about a girl spiritual quest, really.
Yeah. And my hope is that this vision that you've had and the journey that Nicole, your main character, is on, because it is one of progress, it is one of insight and awareness and opening, while dealing with this abuse situation that's been in her life for years, and still finding her voice and her place as a spiritual person, as a practitioner. Not letting that be taken.
Yeah, I think one of the risky places that the book goes in is asking the question of whether she's qualified to teach as well, because there is that barrier, I think, between for qualifying as a teacher in Zen and in other traditions. It's actually pretty rigorous, and you have to be approved by your teacher to become a teacher in this case. And this is related to the Me Too movement. I think one really heartening thing I've seen in Buddhist organizations around the country is an increase in female leadership and women leading Zen organizations. And I think that might be one of the most positive ways that future abuse might be prevented, where if women have an equal say in the leadership of an organization, that might really help.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we've seen this in the discussions we've had on this podcast about women and people of color, and how important it is to have folks who are in decision-making, very real decision-making positions of power that can keep things honest and have a representation that includes diversity and equity. So thank you very much for that. And for those listening, if you'd like to find out more about Blair and her work, her website, and we'll link this on the episode page, is blairhurley.com. And we'll have a link to the book as well. Blair, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.